In this video, we're going to take a look at the stroke layer style. The purpose of the stroke layer style is to put a band of some form of color or pattern or gradient around the edge of your layer. Now in this case, I've got my stick figure layer, and this is the border of his transparency. So let's go ahead and double click on this layer and jump down to stroke, and already you can see a result. We have this little band of black which goes all the way around my shape. Now let's take a look at the properties for the stroke. It's broken up into two groups, being structure and fill type. Structure will control the shape of the stroke itself, how big it is, where it's positioned on the surface, that sort of thing. And then fill type is going to allow you to control what that stroke is made of. Is it made of a color, a gradient, a pattern, and so on. So let's go ahead and start by taking a look at our structure properties. Size is pretty straightforward. It's just a size for the stroke in pixels, like so. We can set this to be outside our shape, and notice that because this is set to outside, when I adjust my size, the stroke gets bigger by expanding outward. I can switch this to inside, and we're expanding inward, or I can set this to center, meaning that the stroke stays centered on the outer edge and it grows both inside and outside. I do want to mention something though. If you're doing a lot of hand painting of your shapes like I've done here, this little stick figure was actually painted with a digital tablet which does respect pressure. That has caused certain strokes to have varying degrees of opacity at the edges. So like here at the very edge of the hand, at this hand, and at this foot, we have less than 100% opacity. That has caused an interesting issue with the stroke itself because certain pixels of low intensity are getting a stroke around them, which causes these funny artifacts at the corners. For this reason, strokes tend to look a lot better, generally a lot nicer, on things like text, where you have crisp, well-defined edges. Anywhere an edge is kind of ill-defined or a little organic, you can end up with these anomalies. So in this case, I'll just switch over to outside and they won't be anywhere near as prevalent. Now moving down from here, you have a blend mode for the stroke, so you can set this to some other blend mode such as darken, multiply, anything you may need, but be aware of something in that this will not blend with the original pixels of the layer itself. And it can blend with anything on other layers underneath, however. Now the reason that's important to keep in mind is that currently the color of our stroke, as you can see, is black. So if I grab one of the blend modes that is only intended to lighten, say something like screen, as you may recall, screening with a color of black yields no result. It's kind of like adding 0 to an existing number. You get whatever color was actually there to begin with. Now, if this stroke was actually being overlaid on our existing layer, and we switch to inside as our position, you would fully expect for no change to take place. But watch very closely as I do this. If I switch to inside, notice that it looks like my shape actually shrunk a little bit. And as I increase the size, it fades away to nothing. That's because this stroke is not considered to be an overlay on our shape. It's actually replacing pixels at the edge of the layer itself. So if I was to take my opacity, actually, excuse me, let me go ahead and switch this back over to normal, and now I play with my opacity. Notice that here we are. Now, our position is set to inside, so the outer edge of our stroke is the same as the outer edge of our original shape. If I switch stroke off, that outer edge doesn't change in position at all. Ideally, or I'm not going to say ideally, it's just off the top of your head, if you were thinking of your stroke as being something overlaid on the original shape, pulling down the opacity should just mean that you're exposing that original shape. But since you're actually replacing pixels, you're making that outer edge disappear. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So there's a look at all of these structure settings. Now I'm going to go ahead and switch our position back over to outside just because it looks a little cleaner. We'll leave the size nice and big so that various things that we explore in our fill type will be a little easier to see. Obviously our first setting by default is color. So we get a color picker and we can set this to any color of the rainbow. So we can make something garish such as green with a bright green outside or bright red outside, which actually kind of hurts my eyes a little bit. But there you have it. Very, very straightforward. We'll go ahead and cancel that and leave it at black. Your fill type is a drop-down property in and of itself, so we can set this to gradient, and all of our settings in here will update to settings specific for a gradient. Now, I'll give you a heads up. I have used a gradient-based stroke as a way to cheat and create an effect kind of like a metal band surrounding something. Just as a random example, if you're creating something like an icon that you might find, just because I happen to have my iPhone handy, kind of like the icon that you see on the desktop of iOS devices, and if you're totally unfamiliar, then I understand. It's just a little rounded box. But you can create a stroke around the outside of that, and you can put a vertical gradient around that. And if I make this a little thinner, it becomes a little easier to see. You get kind of this mock-up, kind of cheesy style of metallic result around the edge of your surface. So if I take my background and make it to something darker so we're not fading away to complete black, you can kind of start to see that result. It just looks a little shiny at the top and less shiny at the bottom. It's a very neat trick to apply, and it's very cheap and easy to play with. It also stands the test of editing, so if you need to make it run in a particular direction, of course you can do that. Now let's take a look at the gradient settings. We can just click on the gradient itself, and that jumps us into the gradient editor, where we can choose an existing preset if we want, or we can take the existing gradient and edit it by moving the color flags, moving the opacity flags directly above that. I'm not going to turn this video into a breakdown over the gradient editor itself, but this is where you can go to create your own custom gradients. We'll go ahead and cancel that. If you want to just grab an existing preset without going into the editor, click on the little black arrow here and you can just grab one of the existing presets. But I'll go ahead and leave this on black and white for now. You can of course reverse a gradient to flip it around. You have various styles of gradient, which are going to be a little hard to see with our gradient being so thin. So I'm going to blow this way up and just make it ridiculously huge, even beyond a point where it would be all that viable. Oh, it's also kind of interesting to note, I'm getting a little bit of nickeling here around the outside edge of this shape, and by that, it's kind of like a reference to like an old school Canadian nickel, where you get the hard, solid, straight edges around the outside, and you can see those appearing there. Just kind of be aware of that. So if we change our style from linear, which is just fading from one color to the other over a linear direction, we can switch this to radial. And you'll notice that when I do this, I can click and drag and move that radial position. On that note, if this was still set to linear, I can click and drag here in the document, and I can move the positioning of that gradient. So it's just one of the neat tricks you can do, just like with a gradient overlay. You can choose to align this with the layer or not. If we switch this over to angle, we get our kind of sweeping result where we start off with one color and then sweep around 360 degrees to our other color, like so. We have reflected, which is going to start at one color and then go out in both directions toward the opposite color, which is great for metallic style effects as well. We have diamond. And then we also have one that wasn't available inside of Gradient Overlay, and that is Shape Burst. And as soon as you switch this on, it becomes relatively apparent what's going on here. We're starting at one color and moving to the opposite color perpendicularly to the edge of our surface. So this is kind of like having a precise outer glow. And by that I mean if you take a look at outer glow and set its technique to precise, it kind of does the exact same thing, so just something to keep in mind. But if you want to have a stroke which changes color as it goes from the inside to the outside, then there's how you go about it. And if you keep this kind of nice and thin, you can kind of see why you'd want to do that. It does give you the result of something kind of sort of like a cheap emboss effect, depending on how you play with it. But of course that's going to be one of those, eye of the beholder kind of things. I'll switch this back over to linear. Of course the next thing we have is our angle. That's just going to adjust the angle of the gradient. And then we have scale, which allows us to control the size of the blending area. Now, we haven't explored all the fill types yet. If we jump down, we can take a look at pattern as well. And this allows us to apply a pattern to our stroke. We can take an existing pattern and make it into a preset at any time by clicking on the Make Preset button. We can snap the pattern to the origin if it has been moved around. Of course, you can just click and drag here inside your view to move that pattern around to a specific location. We can scale a pattern up and down. Just be aware that scaling it too much upward will give you some nasty pixelized results, and of course too little will give you really bad repetition. So it's kind of a thing of just finding just the right amount. Though generally, if it's just a stroke, you won't be paying too much attention to exactly what the pattern looks like. This is a nice way to create a stroke that is kind of broken up and irregular looking though. So feel free to kind of play with that and see what kind of results you get. And then finally, you can choose whether or not to link this pattern with the layer. If this is set to on and you start moving your layer, you'll notice the pattern comes right along for the ride. However, if I jump back in and I switch this off and click OK, now when I move, the pattern stays put while the layer moves around. So again, you get that kind of cardboard cutout style of result. Finally, at the very bottom, we can take any settings we have for the stroke itself and make these the default, or at a single click, we can reset to those defaults. That does, however, conclude all of the various settings for the stroke, including all the fill types. That will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.